Should we support Israel as a nation? My guest today is Dr. Jeff Myers. He is the president of Summit Ministries, and he is going to unpack the history, the ideology, and the spiritual forces that are at play in the battle between our Western civilization and those seeking to upend it. This is going to be a fantastic conversation. This is the Heidi St. John podcast. Stick around. I think you're going to be encouraged. So, Dr. Jeff, welcome to the podcast. Great to see you.
Heidi, great to see you as well.
So I'm fascinated by this subject. I've talked about the United States and our relationship with Israel for a long time here at the show, but increasingly, we are getting feedback from listeners who are kind of buying the mainstream media trope and all the things that we see being pushed out as we're gaslit to side with a terrorist organization, right? We're seeing people now openly siding with Hamas on the streets of the United States of America, who has always been historically a friend to Israel. But I think these are confusing times, particularly for younger Christians who have been, gaslit by the mainstream media, or maybe they've come out of a public university or a public high school. And we're watching these protests increasing, right, on our college campuses around the United States. And they're supporting what is absolutely unbelievable. I mean, we wouldn't have been having this conversation 5 years ago, but we're having it now. The problem is real. And I'm kind of wondering how we're going to get the hearts and minds of Gen Z. So many things I want to ask you, but I'm curious to know why you decided to tackle this topic right now, and do you think we can turn it around?
I decided to tackle it because I think we can turn it around, but it's absolutely very serious. We have a cultural divide in this country over Israel. And the cultural divide is not between the left and the right, Republicans and Democrats. It's not even between secular people and religious people. The divide is between older Americans and younger Americans.
Ooh, true.
Younger Americans, influenced largely by social media. I think we need to add that into your list of other places they might have picked up this information, have come to believe that Hamas is righteous and Israel is evil. They've bought into this oppressor versus oppressed mindset that they've heard on their campuses. And young evangelicals can be susceptible to this because they start with the belief, and we've taught them all their lives, don't be a bully. If you see a bully, stand up for the underdog. And they fuse that with the oppressor versus oppressed idea, and they come to believe, in kind of a twisted theological reflection, that if somebody is suffering more in their judgment, then therefore that person is more righteous. And just by these few little twists, they end up supporting an apocalyptic rape and death cult up against a key ally of the United States. And I don't think it is about Israel. And you and I have talked about this. It's not just about a strip of land in the Middle East. It's about everything, everywhere. The ultimate target here is Judeo-Christian civilization. I think I shared with you that I was in Washington, D.C. last week, just after the protests. My plane arrived after the protests were done, and I guess all the protesters went to the bars or whatever, I don't know. But I saw the monuments that they defaced, and one of them said, Hamas is coming.
That's terrifying.
And then on the replica of the Liberty Bell that's in front of Union Station, they put down the hammer and sickle of the Soviet Union and wrote Intifada Revolution. It's very clear these people are intending to have a Marxist-type overthrow of the West, and they believe that if they can start with Israel, they will get the United States. I've had people tell me in Israel, people in the Palestinian territories, Israel is the little Satan, America is the great Satan.
It's like listening to the Ayatollahs. I mean, it really is. It's just, it's talking points that I never thought I would hear uttered on the streets of the United States. And even maybe perhaps more shocking was Kamala Harris refusing now, the presumptive nominee of the Democrat Party, who I thought they were about a republic, but apparently they'll just replace their unelected, their unelected now nominee for the United States president. And she refused to comment. And when she did comment, her comments were horrifying. What do you make of that?
Well, I think she's of the mindset, and I don't like to call people names, but you look at where she grew up, what she represented, and what she has believed all of her life. She is not a supporter of the state of Israel. I don't know if she believes that the state of Israel is legitimately in existence, because a third of young Gen Zers don't even believe that Israel has a right to exist. I don't know what Vice President Harris believes about that, but I can tell you that she's at odds with a lot of people in her party who believe that Israel needs to be supported by us, and that this is a key strategic ally in that region, and that what information they have been fed through the mainstream media is actually provably false.
Well, and these young people, as you and I were talking about the other day, these young people don't really even know what they are protesting against. I mean, half the time, they're out there shouting to the river and the sea, and you ask them, well, what's the river? They don't know. Well, what's the sea? Yeah. Well, we don't know. I'm only here because I had a friend from Columbia University tell me that they needed help on the front lines, the front lines. And
yeah.
and you said
it's funny, but it's true. 55% of the protesters could not name the river or the sea.
Shocking.
And even that chant, if you look at that chant in Arabic, have somebody pronounce it who knows Arabic. It does not rhyme in the way it does in English. That is cultivated for an English-speaking audience. That should give you some insight into the nature of the propaganda that's at play.
Yeah. So you've written this book, you've done a pretty amazing deep dive into this topic, which I think it's really important. And the statistics in the book are shocking. You wrote that nearly half, so 47% of Gen Z sympathetic to Hamas, and they're 3 times as likely as the general population to deny Israel's right to exist. Gen Z Christians are just as likely to hold these views. Why are we seeing such a divergence away from traditional views? The church has always supported the state of Israel. And now we're watching young people coming out of our churches who are ambivalent at best. So they maybe they just don't care, don't see why it's our, don't see why we care, or worse than that, they are in support of a Palestinian state.
Well, the process of persuasion, when somebody gets, well, I should say the process of propaganda, the process of indoctrination, because this is not persuasion, it's indoctrination. The process of indoctrination is fascinating. Usually it begins with some belief that gets tapped into. You already, for example, if you don't have a sense of purpose in life, if somebody says, I can give you a sense of purpose if you join my group, right, you might be more likely to do it. So 73% of baby boomers say they are proud to live in the United States. 16% of Gen Zers say they are proud to live in the United States. That is at the heart of it. They have come to believe through the education system, through what they see in social media, and through the nasty dialogue they hear in politics, that America is a bad place, that America is more a force for evil in the world than a force for good. This is not new, but all of a sudden it has a target, because people can see pictures of destroyed buildings in Gaza. They can see Israel, the IDF sending their artillery into Gaza and places like that. And they say it could not be clearer who the oppressor is and who the oppressed people are. And what they have come to believe, that the oppressed people may legitimately use any means to defend themselves. So they may use terror, and that is legitimate. They may rape and murder and mutilate people, and that is legitimate because they're standing against an oppressor, and the oppressors are the ultimate evil.
So you just pointed out that you saw with your own 2 eyes when you were in Washington, D.C., sort of the leftovers of the horrific events that we saw unfold in support of Hamas. And these guys are saying Hamas is coming. And I'm wondering, how concerned should we be that this is actually taking root in our universities and really, for lack of a better word, seems to be radicalizing our young people?
I think we should be deeply concerned. I did not start 2024 wanting to write a book about Israel. In fact, I went to Israel, to the war zone. I interviewed people. I spent time with the IDF with artillery shells flying overhead. I visited the communities that had been attacked. I spent time with the police, talking with them, spent time with people on the left and the right, progressives, conservatives, people who are religious, people who are secular, Arabs, Jews, because I wanted to get to the heart of all this information. And I think they are what I came back with, what I intended to turn into a media guide for this one, turned into a book. It's called Should Christians Support Israel? It is, I believe, I believe this is one of the clearest indications we have of the left's plan for taking down Judeo-Christian civilization. If we cannot help young adults overcome the indoctrination they've received on this issue, I'm not sure what issues we can help them overcome the indoctrination.
So how important is it then that the church get back to talking about this? Because it seems to me that it's been so politicized. And of course, the church has a wrong-headed understanding that there needs to be this giant wall, the separation of church and state, this wrong understanding of a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote to the Danbury Baptist Church. But it really, the left has weaponized it. And so the church has decided, well, if it even feels a little bit political, we don't want to talk about it. How important is it that, and there's a lot of people listening to the show right now who have access to a pastor. And I'm curious I'd love to get your book into the hands of every pastor in the United States and say, hey, we need to be talking about this from the pulpit. But of course, it's Heidi St. John. What do you say?
Well, they can read the book and make a decision about it. Tens of thousands of pastors have already gotten a copy of the book and are starting to spread it to their congregation. I'm very grateful for that. I think the conversation in churches needs to be about ideas and their consequences. If you start with a biblical worldview, you're going to end up trying to find out what's actually real, right? A biblical worldview is about reality. It's not about we're trying to fight for our viewpoint and gain power up against your viewpoint when you're trying to gain power. We're with Jesus. John 8:32. If you follow my teachings, you will be my disciples. You will know the truth. Literally in Greek, that means reality. Aletheia means reality. You will know reality. And that understanding of reality will set you free. So we're about the reality here. And here's the reality that's the biblical worldview conflict. I do not believe this issue is primarily geopolitical. I believe it is primarily theopolitical. That unless you understand that there are different perspectives and understandings of God and his work in the world, you won't get this issue. This is not just about land. But, if somebody's a secularist, they believe only a material world exists, then what else is there besides land? That's it. So they can't understand what's happening, and they'll never be able to solve it. Without the input of thoughtful Christians, we're not going to be able to manage difficult situations like that.
So you're saying that in light of kind of where we are right now, and I guess this is where I fall, because I'm watching, young people. I've got kids in their 30s, and I'm watching these young students and young adults grappling with this, and I can feel sort of hopeless about it, because to me, I grew up, it was kind of a no-brainer. We talked about it at the church. We listened to Ronald Reagan give his great speeches in the 80s about the support of Israel. We've always been a friend of Israel. And so to see the tide turn in this way, I think is really alarming, and people feel frustrated. But you wrote in the book that you actually have hope, and which I thought was fascinating. You said that the polling showed that Gen Z is highly likely to change their mind and their support of Hamas when they are presented with factual and historical proof about the Israel-Palestinian conflict. And so I guess the question becomes, at the rate of propaganda that's coming out from especially our universities and certainly the mainstream media, how do we fight against that so that Generation Z can be presented with historical facts and with proof and evidence of what reality is?
I'm glad you mentioned the polling, and I talk about this in the book, Should Christians Support Israel? But we did a poll with Scott Rasmussen, very well-respected pollster, and we were able to ask questions and then ask follow-up questions depending on people's responses. So, for instance, we asked them, do you believe that Israel's greater military power and wealth makes its cause against Hamas unjust? And 47% of young adults said yes. Then the follow-up question to those who said yes was, do you believe that the fact that Hamas leaders have all become millionaires and billionaires by skimming off of international aid for destitute Gazans makes their cost? 57% said yes, 23% said now, not sure. Okay, they changed their mind within one fact, or they now expressed uncertainty. And I believe that when somebody believes something that's bad, if they're uncertain about it, that's better than if they're certain. So that's a huge change. It does seem that, and we've asked, I can give you other examples, but when we give the facts to people, about 50% of them change their mind. That's we cannot just say, oh, we've got a different story or we've got a better story or our narrative or whatever. No, you've got to actually dig in and give people facts.
One of the things I'm kind of interested in seeing your perspective on has to do with propaganda. So we lived, through COVID, which was just rife with propaganda, right? We saw it every which way, every time we turn around, it was a different news media outlet. We learned about Operation Mockingbird, how typically the legacy media tends to parrot ideas. I mean, right down, it's almost like these guys have a script. And it seems to me that the same thing is happening in our universities and even in our high schools when students are passing out pro-Palestinian, pro-Hamas leaflets on high school campuses. And I'm curious if you can, because you do it in the book, but I'd love it if you could give listeners a little bit of a preview of what that propaganda looks like. So, for example, what are these young people listening to that is making them so hostile toward Israel and so reticent to even hear the Israeli side of the argument?
Yeah. Well, let me say, first of all, I don't believe that propaganda is universal. I think there is such a thing as legitimate persuasion. But there is a difference between persuasion and propaganda. Mm-hmm. I don't think one man's persuasion is another man's propaganda. I think there's a clear difference. Persuasion is using ethical arguments to help people arrive at the truth. Propaganda is using oral to secure power. So when you see that something is about a power play, then you probably are dealing with propaganda. I'll give you an illustration. On October 7th, there was a call between all of the leaders of the Students for Justice and Palestine groups on American campuses, 127 groups. They went over their strategy for how they're going to present Israel as a genocidal aggressor within hours of after they attacked Israel. They sent out a kit, a protest kit, to the people in these groups that included a poster of a terrorist paraglider, which is how they came into some of the communities to get past their security in southern Israel. How did they know? It was obvious when you look at this, and I've actually read their sort of their propaganda memo of how they intended to communicate about it. I received a copy of that. It leaked. And really obvious that Hamas, which stands for Islamic Resistance Movement in Arabic, and is apocalyptic. They are a rape and death cult. There is no question about this anymore. Amnesty International even and Human Rights Campaign all acknowledge that this is true, and they are anything but pro-Israel. They planned out their propaganda campaign at the same time they planned their military campaign because they knew they could reach people in the United States who also would like to see the United States fall, people on the progressive left, and propaganda, they could gain allies. All they want to do, all Hamas wants to do, its sole aim is to annihilate the state of Israel. It does not care what happens to Gazans. If you can look at the translated transcripts of the Hamas leaders doing media interviews, you will see that they do not care if every Gazan dies, as long as Israel gets annihilated. And so they have been able to communicate that message in the United States with great effectiveness.
It's kind of amazing, to me at least, the parallels between the way that we're seeing Black Lives Matter, in the summer of love, up here in Seattle, and where we saw riots on the street. Black Lives Matter said we care about, obviously, Black lives, except for they don't care about the Black unborn, don't care about Black police officers, don't care about Black conservatives. And really, Hamas is sort of the same way when they say, hey, we care about the people in Palestine, we care about the Gazans, but they really don't, as you just pointed out. They don't care if these people die, just like Black Lives Matter doesn't care if a Black police officer dies, because they're pushing an ideology. And that is what this is about at the end of the day. The ideology is what is motivating them. Give us a little bit of history for people who are unfamiliar with the conflict, the Palestinian conflict, and where Hamas came from in the first place. Because there are a lot of people that to them, Hamas is relatively new, but the ideology is centuries old.
Yes, and I'm happy to talk about that. I'd like to address the question about Black Lives Matter first, though, because if these protests look similar, it's because the same trainers are training the Palestinian protesters.
Yep.
They're professional protesters. If you want to know what happens in a Palestinian protest, you don't go on the day of the protest. You go the day before. All of the dictators get together and are trained on how to make the protest more aggressive. And then you'll see it's the same trainers. Okay, they're professional, paid protest developers. So why is that important? We do know, based on the research that's been done since the Black Lives Matter campaign back in 2000, we know that the biblical idea of creating unity between races, we know that the Black Lives Matter approach of the Black Lives Matter organization creates further division. So why would we think that's a better idea than the biblical idea that we need to have unity and dialogue between the races? Okay, this gets back this becomes at the heart of what the issue is with Hamas as well. This goes back to the Hegelian dialectic. Hegel was a German philosopher. Hegel believed that it's through conflict. And the Marxists took that idea and said, well, if history advances through conflict, then we want to create conflict and then history will advance. We can make history advance. So the goal is not to create unity, not to create harmony, not to arrive at solutions. The goal is to make people clash, divide them up into different groups, and take any issue and simplify it. It's as simple as the oppressor versus the oppressed. You get those two people ginned up against each other, then they clash and history will advance. So this is Hamas. This has become Hamas's operating strategy. Create conflict, create clash, create bloodshed, create death, film it all. Film the entire thing and show it to the world. Because the more bloodshed there is, the better likelihood they will have of achieving their aim. What is their aim? It is the annihilation of the state of Israel. This goes back a long time, and we can talk about the history of it. It's a very sad history, Indian conflict and all of that in Israel. But it goes back centuries, as you mentioned. A group of people began to take the ideas of Islam from the Quran and see them in a very literal way. So Islam believes everybody who's a Muslim, if you're not Muslim now, you are in rebellion against Allah. And the Quranic prescription, it occurs dozens of times, maybe even up to 100 times if my memory serves, in the Quran. The idea is jihad. That jihad will compel people to cease their rebellion against Allah. There are Muslims in the world who just believe that that's a call to self-discipline, sort of like Christian fasting. There are many who believe, and we're talking tens of millions of Muslims in the world who believe that jihad is a military command. Hamas takes it as a military command. In its original charter, it quoted directly from the Quran that you should slaughter Jews wherever you find them. And they took that on as their operating principle. So why they don't want peace? They do not want peace. To Palestinian leadership in 1948, they said no. 1967, they said no. In 2000, they said no. In 2008, they said no. They only want a one-state solution, a one state without Israel in the picture, and Israel gets annihilated. So why would you attack Israel? Because half the Jews in the world live there. If you can take down Israel, you can literally end the Jewish race. So that's the ultimate goal. That's what Hamas is all about. This is not what most Muslims believe. Most Muslims, if they've thought about jihad as, I'm in rebellion against Allah and I need to submit. But these people do not think that way. We call them Islamists. And they break into two different groups. One of the groups is the Shiites. Those are the people who run Iran. The people in Gaza are not Shiite. Well, maybe a handful of them, but 99% of them are not. But they still work with Iran. And Iran's program is the same. They believe there will come a 12th Imam, Muhammad al-Mahdi, who will take over the entire world and turn it into an Islamic caliphate in which everyone to submit to Allah. The only thing that stands in the way of the coming of the 12th Imam is the existence of the state of Israel. It is Iran's religious motivation to eliminate the state of Israel, not its geopolitical ambition to eliminate the state of Israel. Our leaders do not understand this. And until they do, they're never going to be able to manage the problem.
So I guess it brings me to the broader question, which, needs an answer, which I think is part of the reason why you took so much time to write this important book. Why should we care? I mean, right? There's all these things happening, and we got issues happening in Africa. We got people fighting in Nigeria. There are people. We got issues with migration now. We're seeing terrible scenes unfold in France. We just saw a couple of days ago a young man, 17-year-old boy, take a knife out and kill and maim lots of school children. There are problems, Jeff, all over the world. And I think what you're hearing a lot of these young people say is, why should this matter? Why should the United States get in or get out? Why should we, certainly why should we support them? But why not just stay out of it and let it just play out?
Well, the United States is committed, and this is for 75 years now, to support the state of Israel under oppression. There is one Jewish nation in the world. There are 57 members of the Organization of Islamic States. There are 15 million Jews in the entire world. There are 120, or let's see, one. I just put it this way: there are 120 Muslims for every Jew. Okay?
Wow.
So this is a tiny, who were oppressed in history. They have been oppressed even by the United States. The United States made terrible mistakes. For example, the George Gallup's polling started in the late 1930s, and 8 in 10 Americans said that they felt sorry for the Jews, but they did not want them to coming here. They did not want them immigrating here. And so millions of Jews died who could have lived if the United States had had a policy that was not anti-Semitic. When you build a worldview based on the idea that some people's lives are not worth living because of the way they worship God or because of their history, if you build your worldview based on that, you cannot build a better world. The world you're going to build is always support Israel's right to exist, number one. Second, that we recognize that there never will be peace in the region as long as Hamas is able to have a government or form a military. They are the enemy of the Palestinian people as well as the enemy of Israel, and there will never be peace in the Middle East until they're dealt with. And then third, from a Christian standpoint, that God is not done with the Jewish people. Mm-hmm. We have been grafted into God. We are part of the covenant that God gave to the nation of Israel. And that covenant was, I will bless you, and all of the nations of the earth will be blessed through you. Those who bless you will be blessed. Those who curse you will be cursed. The Apostle Paul said in Galatians chapter 3, those who believe, referring to Christians, are blessed along faith. That cup is the same, and we are part of it. It is imperative, I believe, that Christians step up and get involved. Now, I've had Christian friends say, I don't believe the theology of this, but I support Israel politically. At this point, I don't think Israel, it doesn't matter to Israelis whether your support is political or religious or both. But they need help at this moment in history. And it's not like other nations. You can send billions of dollars off to Ukraine. It disappears. Nobody knows what happened to it. But Israel is not like that. Israel buys most of the weapons that it gets from us, actually drives down the cost of the weapons that we produce for our own military. They are able to take that military aid and use it to protect themselves, their people, on 8 different fronts. They're fighting on 8 fronts right now. And they're able, in turn, to help bring economic prosperity to the entire region. That's why so many nations in that region are eager to reject Hamas's narrative and eager to sign peace agreements with Israel. So we have the opportunity to stand up and say, this is what's right. This is what is true. This makes economic sense for us. All of the major tech companies have most of their innovations take place in Israel, in Tel Aviv. All of the major companies have headquarters there. The economic innovations they send back to the United States have made this a wealthy nation. So this is not just us saying we're going to put money into a funnel and it'll disappear, and at the bottom, nobody ever knows what happened to it. This is quite literally the most significant strategic as well as economic alliance have now, in my view.
What do you make of what's happening in the United States Congress under the leadership of people like Rashida Tlaib and AOC and other voices? You know, the Squad comes to mind. We're now watching, really for the first time in our nation's history, elected representatives calling for the United States to withdraw from its support of Israel. What if you had a crystal ball? Where is that going?
Yeah. I don't think among the members of Congress it's going anywhere right now. Those individuals, though, however, last week received a copy of my book. So I expect the reply with their book report any day now.
Just another reason I like you, Jeff.
And tell me that they've been persuaded that they were wrong in their view.
I love that.
Yeah. I don't know what to make of it.
No, it's I mean, from where I'm sitting, it's just terrifying, right? Because now we're watching, because really this sort of radical Islamist arm, you know, that we see kind of coming out of the Muslim faith, and obviously Hamas is the kingpin of all of these ones. We're watching something phenomenal happening, and that is the United States is, it seems to me, unsure of what to do. If Kamala Harris can't get out there and say, no, you don't get to burn the American flag on the streets of Washington, D.C. and hoist the Palestinian flag and write Hamas is coming and deface our monuments. If we can't stand up in this moment, it seems like we're at an inflection point in the country. And so the elections obviously matter in 2024. And, you know, my strong belief that Christians need to be involved politically, our voices need to be heard. It absolutely matters. But we're not going to solve the problem in one election, right? Because we're cranking out by the hundreds of thousands young people from our universities every single year who hate this country and don't value liberty and don't understand these forces at play. And so from your perspective, watching what's happening, I have two questions for you. How important and influential do you think it's going to be, or how disastrous would it be if someone like Kamala Harris is elected to the highest position of authority in our country? And what can we do to turn the tide around? You're talking to people who want to help, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes. It's important to think about the presidential election, the congressional elections, state legislative elections, local elections, because the anti-Israel sentiment spread all the way across the country. People are advocating, even at some state legislators the other day in different states, they're getting all of these bills to divest from Israel. If they can't destroy Israel politically, then they want to destroy it economically. At every level, there are actions that are going to be needed. But the President of the United States does have enormous power on this. The President of the United States can direct the Department of Defense to stop weapons shipments to Israel. Now, those weapon shipments, this is all of the weapons, but, you know, back in 1979, Israel and Egypt entered into a peace agreement with one another. Nobody thought that could ever happen. It's held for 45 years. A part of the agreement is that Israel gets a check from the United States every year for $3 billion. And Egypt gets a check from the United States every year for $3 billion. They are required to spend something like 70% of that buying weapons from the United States, so those nations can feel secure and strong and then not feel like they have to attack each other. So, you know, this is part of a long-standing agreement that we have that has actually been a force for bringing stability to the Middle East. It's one of the easiest decisions I think that can be made. But if the president directs the Department of Defense to not send the weapons, Israel cannot hold out. 1,000 fighters who came from on October 7th. There are 100,000 armed fighters that are at the direct beck and call of the nation of Iran in Lebanon directly to Israel's north. There are 20-some thousand Syrian fighters, mostly who came from Afghanistan, who want to attack Israel from the northeast. You have Jordan to the east, which is an unstable country, and that king is very weak right now. You have Palestinians are a real sticking point because they absolutely do not want Palestinians coming onto their land, right? And everybody says we feel sorry for the Palestinians. Not one single country in that region will give them citizenship. Not one, except for Israel. Israel has a kind of citizenship for Palestinians. Isn't that ironic?
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable. The other thing that I think is remarkable is the rise of anti-Semitism in the United States. And we're certainly seeing this playing out on the news every night. I read an article, I'll have to send it to you, I'll send you a link, in The Atlantic by a guy named Franklin Foer, and I don't know if you've seen it, but he shares that sentiment, and his piece was titled "The Golden Age of American Jews is Ending." And he was talking about the rise of anti-Semitism and the silence on behalf of the evangelical church in support of the state of Israel, and also the lack of education about the Holocaust. I was just in Washington, D.C. and visited again the Holocaust Museum. And it's important that people understand so that we don't lose sight of where the Jews in the United States have come from. But would you agree, just with a cursory glance at this idea, this sentiment that the golden age of American Jews is ending in the United States? Or do you think, no, I think we could turn it around?
Well, I hope we can turn it around. I think the way the article is titled sounds kind of conspiracy theory oriented. But I can tell you that the Anti-Defamation League, the ADL, has cataloged anti-Semitic activity since 1979. And they are Semitic activity in all of the time that they have been recording it. So, this is almost 50 years that they've been doing this. I would say anti-Semitism, I would distinguish. Anti-Semitism does not mean that you disagree with some of Israel's policies. I disagree with a lot of America's policies, and I'm still an American, right? What anti-Semitism means is believing that Israel does not right to exist itself. This is an easy call for Christians. Israel is, John Spencer, who's America's leading expert on protecting non-combatants in a time of war, says that Israel has done more than any other army in history to protect non-combatants, including the United States in Iraq and Afghanistan. Israel has sent in almost 500,000 tons of food aid to Gazans. That's enough to fulfill half of the food needs of the entire country, assuming they don't get any food from any place else. 75% of Gaza's agricultural production is still intact. When Hamas came to Israel, they tried to destroy Israel's agricultural production, managed to destroy or at least to stop about 70% of it. Israel has not done that. Israel's not acting genocidally. They have not destroyed the crops, trying to starve people out. With the food aid coming in and the agricultural production, Gazans should have 125% of their food needs met. Why don't they? Because we've identified the wrong enemy. We think Israel is the enemy here. And in fact, Hamas is the enemy of the Palestinian people.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, your book's coming out at just the right time. And I hope that there are a lot of homeschool parents listening to this who need to teach their children about the conflict in Israel and why it's so important that we as Christians support Israel. If people are interested in picking up your book, Dr. Jeff, where can they find it?
The easiest way to find it is I just want to send it to you as my gift. If you want to kick in for shipping and handling, that's totally fine. You can do that. But you go to summit./Israel. And you'll find a link that says claim my book. You just put in your address. I will send you a copy. It's a really important thing to some of the donors to Summit Ministries that the truth get out about how to de-radicalize Gen Z. And this is one of the projects that's helping to make that happen. So especially if you know people in a church, if you're willing to do a book study with others, even if they don't agree with all my conclusions, that's fine. That doesn't hurt my feelings. I just want the truth to get out there. So go to summit.org/Israel to get your copy of the book.
I love that. Dr. Jeff Myers, you are a national treasure. Thanks for coming on my show. It's always a delight to have you, and I'll look forward to talking with you again soon.
That sounds great. Thank you, Heidi.
For more information on my guest today, you can head on over to HeidiSt.John.com/podcast. I will link back to this. You guys take advantage of it. Pick up a copy of this book, get a copy for your pastor, read it to your kids, add it to your homeschool curriculum for the fall. We've got to be educated about the crisis that is facing the United States and our support of Israel. And this is a great way for you to get that information. Again, I'll link back to that in the show notes today. Thank you guys so much for listening, and I will see you right back here again at the intersection of faith and